Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shelley Reed. I am the manager of the Legal Services National Technology Assistance Project. I use the pronoun she, her, and I am a middle-aged woman with glasses and long, shoulder length brown hair. And today I'm wearing a blue jacket and a peach colored shirt. And we give those descriptions for those who have low vision or visual impairments. All right, and today we are here with Tony Liu, who is going to give us an introduction to document management. Welcome, Tony.
My name is Tony Liu. My pronouns are he, him. I am an Asian male, bald, I'm wearing a blue hoodie sweatshirt today because it's a bit chilly here. Um, and today we will be talking about document management. We're giving an overview on document management and talking a little bit about document management systems. So the important thing to understand about document management is that there's a big distinction between file management and document management. And I would suggest that most legal aid organizations, when they are talking about document management, what they're really thinking about is file management. In our experience working with various legal aid organizations, um, a lot of organizations sort of have developed various file management policies and procedures about where to save certain files. They may have come up with file naming conventions, things like that. That's only one small portion of what we would consider more broadly document management. Um, so file management is really strictly about storage, typically, right? So where do you store things and how do you label them? So those files, so you know what they are, where to find them. Um, and it might include, folder structure rules. But document management is really a lot more than that. It's about kind of sort of managing the document as a concept, right? Like conceptually, what is a document? Um, so and it encompasses the entire life cycle of that document. So both from creating it all the way to the process of deleting it and all of the steps in between, sort of where you organize it and the editing and writing of that document, how you collaborate on that document, and then where you store it. So um, for those who are kind of more visual learners like I am, there's a diagram that kind of illustrates that life cycle and the process that document you kind of have to go through in creating a document. And here, what I'll emphasize is that when we talk about a document, it can actually be multiple files, right? So if you see that middle box there where it says assembly and approval, think about if you are writing preparing a motion, right? A motion is usually comprised of lots of different component parts, many of which may be different actual digital files that you then have to assemble into one um, final document. And it can also include, in the physical realm, the actual document that you have to submit to the or file with the court, where you have to put in tabs and a blue bucket, right? Like so that the thing that you call a document isn't just a word file represented on your computer. That word file may be 95% of what makes up that document, but you know, it's important to think of the document kind of more writ large, which helps you kind of start thinking about why document management is a little bit different than what drive do I save things in, what subfolder, and what's the naming convention for the Word file that I'm saving, right? There are other things that you may have to save up to and including the final PDF version of that Word file that you are creating, which is a part of that document and may represent the final version. So to kind of talk a little bit more about like what comprises effective document management. We've talked about storage, right? And that's sort of intuitive, right? You need to have a place to put those documents, and and ideally a good document management process and procedure would require a centralized location for document access that's easy to search, makes it easy for everybody to find them, right? Find the documents they need. Um, Current modern document management really emphasizes the ability to collaborate and annotate easily, right? So facilitating co-authoring or co-editing a document. Um, we've moved a lot away from the sort of the world where people might have to check out a document, right, and check it back in. Or earlier document management systems required imposed this requirement that only one person could edit a particular document at a time, and you'd check it out. And if you checked it out, nobody else could make changes. Um, a lot of legal aid organizations never actually got to that point, right? They they just, because they were just working with files, the sort of collaboration and annotation process often happened in email, right? You'd email an attachment to somebody, they would make their changes and rename the file with their initials appended to the end to indicate that they'd made their edits, and then send it to the next person. Um, that is in and of itself a type of document management, a way of managing that document. But there's currently, in the modern um, world of cloud-based computing, there's a lot of other ways that that collaboration and annotation can happen that are a lot more efficient and effective, and hopefully don't result in somebody having to, compare two different versions and figure out which changes to keep and which uh, to ignore. And and kind of connected to that concept is version control, right? So controlling the version of the document so you know which version of the document you're looking at. Is it interim draft? Is it the most recent draft? Is it the final version? So that's really important to in kind of effectively managing your documents. Um, and modern document management principles really kind of incorporate security and compliance concepts. So audit trails are kind of a core feature of having effective document management, as well as just security and access control, right? So setting the permissions correctly, managing those permissions. So um, that being said, I'd like to ask everyone to take a poll to find out what your organization's current experience with document management is. We'll give a few seconds for people to answer this. Looks like we've got 9 responses. Leave it open for a little bit longer. All right. Okay. Well, it looks like there are some folks who are still kind of just scratching the surface, or kind of getting to know what document management is. And others are using something like SharePoint or Google Docs or Dropbox to manage their documents, which is good. It's um, SharePoint, Google Docs is definitely something that is a good kind of introductory platform to document management. There's some more intermediate and advanced features baked into those platforms, and we'll talk about some of those a little bit. There's also what we call dedicated document management systems, or DMS, right? DMS is the shorthand for document management systems, in the same way you might hear people talk about like a case management system as a CMS, although the CMS is used in other technical contexts as well. But a DMS typically, when you hear that, is what people are referring to when they say are talking about document management systems. So I guess the important thing to emphasize after that poll is that you don't need a document management system. You don't need DMS software to manage your documents. If you think about law firms back before the days of computing, they were managing documents. They didn't have software to manage their documents. They probably had policies about where case files were stored, and they might have policies about within a case file, pleadings had to be saved within the case file a certain way, and correspondence had to be saved a certain way. So you don't again, the important thing to recognize is that the answer to not having a document management system is not to go out and buy a document management system, right? Like that's not the first step. Typically is you need to make sure that you have policies and procedures in place about how you are handling all of those steps that we talked about in the document lifecycle. Um, and I'll just kind of pause quickly. There's a question. So is SharePoint considered a document management system? I would say that SharePoint can serve as a document management system, but by itself, it is not, right? SharePoint does a lot of things. It's an online collaboration tool. It's an information and knowledge management tool. And it can manage documents. And there are some features of dedicated document management systems that SharePoint may not be able to do. Um, in our experience for legal aid organizations, SharePoint probably is more than good enough to kind of have like a robust document management practice. Um, but there's a lot you have to kind of think through and configure and set up in order for SharePoint to kind of work that way. And we'll talk a little, I'll show some of the more intermediate and advanced document management features that many organizations probably aren't aware of and aren't using in SharePoint a little bit later. Um, so again, you don't have to have something like SharePoint or a dedicated document management service like NetDocuments or Laserfiche. Those are two examples of document management systems that many law firms use, and some legal aid organizations have used them. Um, you don't need to have those in order to effectively manage your documents, but a DMS can really help to help your organization implement those policies and procedures in a structured way, right? You can automate certain processes. So for example, if you have like a destruction policy of like once a case is outside of the requirements for retention for those files for your state, bar, you can create a automated notification, right? That gives you a list of these cases are no longer within the period of time that we have to retain these files, and you may want to delete them then, right? And um, being able to automate the certain things like that, as well as other workflows like approval workflows, right? Like somebody's drafted something and then a supervisor needs to approve it. You can automate those processes within um, a document management system, where if you didn't have one, but you just had a policy that, a staff attorney must get approval on a document from a supervisor before submitting it to the court, you'd have to manage that kind of without necessarily having a system tracking to see whether a supervisor had approved this document, right? So if you can kind of see that distinction where you can still do everything you need to do without dedicated software, but the software can make it easier. None of it works though if you don't have those policies and procedures defined, right? And that's always the thing that we start with when clients come to us and say we want to implement some kind of document management project is, well, what are your policies? And typically many organizations might have some policies defined, but maybe not all of them, and that's really where you have to start. Another important element of document management that is really kind of critical and helpful is metadata, right? And when we talk about metadata, there's automatically applied metadata, right? So like a file type, is it a docx file? Is it a PDF file? Is it an Excel file, right? That is metadata about that file. Um, you can also have, the creation date, the last modified date, who created the file, who last edited the file. Those are all types of metadata about a document that are typically automatically applied by your operating system, right? Um, but there's also metadata that is applied by users, and that's where it can get really helpful to really think through your policies and set up your procedures, right? So, for example, document types. Document types are a key type of metadata that is really helpful in order to help you really organize your files and your documents. But thinking through, well, how do we want to define these, right? Um, and this often can be a really challenging exercise because when you're defining these types of categories, you want to make sure that you define them in a way that includes every type of document. Um, but you don't also want to get too granular in defining them. So, so it makes it really hard for a staff person to figure out what document type is this, and they have to scroll through a list of 50 different document types. So that definition exercise can be really challenging, but also be pretty fruitful and helpful once uh, you've spent some time refining it and pinning it down for your organization, because it allows for much easier searching for things, right? Because typically things are not organized by type, right? You're not going to have all of your motions in one place because they're going to be organized by case, most likely. But let's say you wanted to do a search for a sample motion uh, to dismiss, and uh, the being able to narrow it to the document type would really kind of help you in that searching effort. Um, and I like to encourage the use of a notes or description kind of field for as a type of metadata, right? Because typically when you look at a file on the computer, you'll see the file name. And beyond that, you may not be really sure about what that file is or what it was used for, what's the purpose of it, what's the sort of salience of it, the importance of it, right? So if you can add a field to that's like a notes or description field, and then encourage your staff to kind of be descriptive about this, like why is this file significant? Well, this is a sample case closing letter for evictions, right? Because the file name itself might just say case closing letter. Um, and you could rename the file, but usually there's information about what that file is and what it's for that could be really helpful to users um, as they're looking for other documents. Usually when we work with our clients, um, we divide documents into two broad categories: case-related documents and non-case related documents. And the important distinction between these two categories is that case-related documents have a natural structure to them, the cases, right? So that makes that starting structure creates a sort of different way of approaching those documents than non-case related documents, which can be really challenging to organize. In a lot of ways, the non-case related documents kind of create a bigger um, kind of a bigger headache for organizations in terms of like, how do we store these? Do we need to store them by department and unit, or what do we do about project documents that maybe multiple departments are working on? How do we organize those? Um, so that can be a significant challenge. There's also, individual or personal files. And so a lot of organizations that are using Microsoft may be using OneDrive in addition to SharePoint. And the question often comes up, so what's the difference between OneDrive and SharePoint? OneDrive is bound to individual accounts, so individual user accounts, and that's where things often end up to to the detriment of the organization being able to kind of centrally manage, right? So if a case related document or a project document ends up in my OneDrive, if if I were to leave the organization, those documents are bound to my account, and so then the organization has to leave my account open to so that others can access those files. And that's assuming that I've even shared those files with other folks. If I haven't shared those files with other folks, then there's this sort of black box of Tony's documents. And then typically what would happen is IT needs to keep them open, and maybe IT will have to go in and share access to my OneDrive to my supervisor after I've departed. And then that supervisor is now managing, her own OneDrive plus my OneDrive plus the OneDrive of every other employee that's departed. And so again, this is kind of goes back to that whole concept of having clear policies about where you store things and why. Personal individual files, I think that's fine for OneDrive, but what does that really mean in the context of a legal aid organization? Um, in in my mind, what that usually probably is like my copy of the holiday schedule, maybe that I've downloaded because I just want to find it easily, or maybe I'm drafting a self-evaluation for my annual review, right? And that's not like a joint document that anybody else really needs to see. But if it's anything related to a case, that should be where all of the other case documents are, right? And if it's anything related to a grant report or a grant, a funding proposal, those should live in a central location that everyone else has access to. Um, so again, coming up with the structures for the non-case related documents, that typically is the biggest lift when you're thinking about document management for an organization. And that's also where some of the retention policy rules are probably kind of need to really be thought through as well, right? So your case related documents, the retention policies typically are defined by the bar, but your non-case related documents, like you might have financial documents that have certain retention dates that are attached to them, things like that. So um, it's really important to define those categories and then start thinking about policies related to those different categories. So if you're in a position now after talking about all of that, thinking like, oh my goodness, we've got like so much to do. We've never done any of this stuff, or haven't thought through any of this stuff, or our document policies are really only, partially defined. How do you improve your document management? Um, so, it's really important to kind of approach this like you would any other kind of initiative within the organization. So first think about, take stock. Like what are you doing now? Maybe you do have document management practices in place already that 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 your staff are following, and some of them may be explicitly defined and some of them may have just evolved as norms and practices within the organization, but maybe they work. So, try documenting those as a good starting point. Then looking for opportunities, so identifying certain pain points. What are the things that frustrate your staff the most? Um, like we don't have a way to collaborate in real time on documents, and we end up sending files back and forth, and then a paralegal or a legal secretary has to take 5 different versions and try to conform it into one draft. That could be an example of a pain point. Another one might be, I don't know where to find case related files. I'm a supervisor. My staff person was on maternity leave and the client came to us saying they want a copy of the file and I can't find it. I don't know where it is, right? So kind of identifying what some of the common pain points are. Um, with all document management, I think it's really important to recognize and acknowledge that it's going to require everyone to make certain adjustments to how they interact with documents, right? Um, I say this because, again, I think that legal aid organizations operate in this is an area where the private bar has implemented technology that's for probably the last 20, 30 years in this space already. And so if you talk to attorneys that, you know, spent their careers at law firms, they already are used to having to use a document management system where, you know, maybe they had to check a document out and check it back in when they were done editing. Maybe they had to, they couldn't just drag and drop a file into a folder to save it. They had to actually, you know, fill out a form every time they were saving a document to indicate what that or what that file was. Um, legal aid organizations, I think, have not really crossed that threshold into that sort of document management practice. And what that, I think what that has resulted in is I think legal aid attorneys are so kind of used to file management and file management on their own terms, like what they're used to doing, um, and what they're comfortable doing, that moving towards a more centralized document management practice is definitely something that takes some adjustment. Um, and then trying to figure out how you prioritize the changes that you're going to be making, how can you minimize disruption while maximizing the impact. And then, like I said, it's going to require a lot of adjustments, so be prepared to provide a lot of training and support, right? So implementing a new document management process or system, or maybe applying some of the document management principles in SharePoint if you're already using SharePoint. Um, I would say in terms of the level of effort and lift and adjustment for the staff is maybe on par with switching to a new case management system, right? So if you're thinking about the level of organizational lift, it may be on par. And for some organizations, this is actually harder than switching to a new case management system, because prior to trying to implement a centralized DMS, maybe they were allowing their staff to kind of save files however they wanted to save them and name them whatever they wanted to name them. And you're really kind of changing up those procedures. So I guess maybe this is a good opportunity to see if anybody has any thoughts right off the bat of, you know, what types of processes are you struggling with? What are some of the common complaints that you might have heard? Are there any major gaps or concerns or anxieties that you have? You can put them in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and kind of take this opportunity to kind of air air any grievances or headaches. Um, I'm also happy to continue on.
I'll start.
Sure.
Um, I think the confusion between SharePoint and OneDrive has
Hmm.
been a problem. I mean, you probably explained it better than anyone has to me before, and I had a lot of
Yeah.
trouble myself understanding the difference.
Yeah.
And then we also have several other drives on our computer at work here. Like there's your personal computer drive, just like your drive on your computer. And then we have some other drives that some people have access to and some people don't, that are shared drives. And I think that gets confusing for people. So potentially maybe just like a cheat sheet would be a helpful thing to have, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
absolutely. So I guess in terms of the OneDrive SharePoint, one other analogy that I use often is to think about OneDrive as like the small 2-drawer file cabinet you might have next to you in your office, and SharePoint as like your central files room at your organization, right? That 2-drawer cabinet shouldn't be the place where a case file lives permanently. It probably shouldn't even necessarily be the place where the case file lives um, in the short term if multiple people are working on that case. Um, and so, you know, that for the most part, it's sort of meant to just be like individual storage of things that aren't meant to be sort of collaborated on, really, and that's kind of the best way I can describe it. Some people will have the practice of starting drafts of things, saving it in OneDrive, but when they reach a point where it's like, okay, I feel comfortable sharing this with other people now, they'll move it to the right place in SharePoint, right? So, um, and then in terms of the like multiple different locations for things, yes, a cheat sheet is really helpful. If your organization has an intranet, right? So that's, again, SharePoint can serve many purposes, intranet being one of them, right? You can have
Mhm.
a map or a sort of guide in your intranet to the different, storage locations for different types of documents and files. Yeah, but that's a very common starting point for organizations starting out on this journey is we've already implemented OneDrive and SharePoint, but nobody really knows the distinction. And there's like 5 different SharePoint sites where this document could go. Plus there's Microsoft Teams and that has files too. And so it's just, there's a lot of it
You'll
kind of
get
goes,
that too.
yeah.
And another thing too, I think now that you're talking, I'm realizing it. So we have a VPN that has to be accessed to access SharePoint.
Hmm.
Does not have to be accessed to access your OneDrive. And so I think it makes it a lot easier for people to just,
Right,
myself included, you share things or, save things to your OneDrive
right, right.
because you don't have to sign into the VPN every time you want to access a document.
Yeah, so that kind of goes back to like how do we improve document management, right? And so in terms of that I would identify as a pain point, right? And there are things where there's technical barriers that maybe don't need to exist that are creating friction and driving people to do the wrong thing, right? And that I would identify as maybe a key thing to really just you know to focus on is like can we eliminate that VPN requirement for accessing SharePoint by making sure that I I suspect is it the VPN might have been put in during the pandemic as like an initial rush to get everybody remote, and maybe it's just persisted that we've seen that before. But or it may be something where it's like your organization hasn't evolved to the point where the your mobile device management is has been kind of done properly so that you can feel confident that people can just go to SharePoint directly from a web browser safely, right? And so the VPN is this added layer of security, but it creates a barrier. So definitely that's sort of a key point of improving document management is trying to eliminate some of those barriers.
If no one else
Well,
has, I have another thing too.
sure, of course, yeah,
Just getting, I mean, you kind of talked about this, but getting people to comply. I mean, we have a naming convention, and I doubt that like
yeah.
1% of documents follow it. And I don't know how you get people to do it.
So yeah, that's tough. I have I have kind of an unconventional opinion on naming conventions, which is I think that they're they're more trouble than they're worth because the compliance issue is so challenging, right? So if you implement a document management system well, you kind of don't necessarily need the naming convention rules to be adhered to as strictly or even at all, because ideally naming conventions typically exist to be able to find a document or understand what a document is, right? But Most document management systems will allow you to search really, really powerfully, and especially now with AI. AI assisted search makes naming conventions almost kind of un, you know, it just unnecessary, right? Especially if you can kind of get down to that point of anyone saving a file, make sure you put a description of that file, and maybe select the document type. And with that information, anyone who wants to find the file, if you're searching it for a file because it's for a certain client, you know, the client's name is going to be all through that document, and the DMS will have indexed all of the words in the document. So you can run a search for the client's name, it will probably pull up the document. But if you search for that client's name and summary judgment and eviction and blah blah blah, it's going to it'll probably find that document for you. So um so I generally encourage organizations not to invest a lot of energy into naming conventions at the start. Like, start thinking about these other things first, and then if you're finding that the search isn't helping, start trying to think about maybe there's other things that you can do. So rather than naming conventions, maybe there's a process where every time you're saving a file into a case related folder, you have to fill out, 2 fields that will then you know, help with locating that document. So that would be one thing. And the dedicated document management solutions, they kind of impose some of this, and I'll show you what I mean when we look at the SharePoint demo. But for example, saving a file in a particular location in a dedicated system like NetDocuments, it's sort of automatically associated with the client, right? So you don't have to put the client's name in the file name because it's the client is metadata in that document already. We'll definitely have more time for discussion and questions. I just kind of wanted to move to some more thoughts here. So there's different levels of document management practice, right? There's sort of the basic, which you have policies, but maybe no dedicated document management system. There's what I call the more intermediate kind of practice, which is file storage platforms that have certain document management system functionality, like SharePoint, Google Docs, Dropbox, etc. And then there's the more advanced document management practice, which is implementing a full-scale document management system like NetDocs and Laserfiche. And I personally, I think the sweet spot is that for most legal aid organizations is that intermediate level. In my experience, those advanced document management systems require a level of investment, of operational kind of investment, a significant amount, to really think through all of the requirements and all of the policies so you can build it in. And then there's administrative overhead that most legal aid organizations, I think, are not necessarily in a place to sustain, right? So a full document management system might require, every time a new case is opened, you'd have to ask an admin for that system to create a workspace for that case. Unless you build in the automations where anytime a case is open in legal server or whatever your case management system is, a corresponding workspace is created in that system. But building that integration, because typically those integrations don't just exist, they have to be built and maintained, is also a significant effort. And any organization that uses legal server does have kind of integrations with Google Docs and with SharePoint, and I believe Dropbox. So, there is an integration that allows you to create a case folder for a case based on certain triggers in legal server, right? And so there's kind of trade-offs of using SharePoint and Google Docs, but I think most of the benefits of the more advanced document management systems, most legal aid organizations, I think, aren't really poised to take advantage of those benefits. And and there's also the cost, right? DMS software can be kind of costly because they are typically by licenses and require licenses per user and become this ongoing expense. I'm not discouraging people from exploring software like NetDocs or Laserfish. I'm just want to kind of emphasize that any organization that does kind of explore those systems needs to go in kind of eyes wide open and understand what the long-term implications of adopting a system like that are. So with any document management system, we talked about collaboration. I think intuitively, most of us think of internal collaboration. There's also external collaboration. There are certain challenges with using document management systems for external collaboration that systems are kind of designed to address. So there's the sort of question of security versus accessibility and finding that balance. We want to make sure that we're sharing things securely, but they have to be easy to access by our external collaborators, whether it's co-counsel or maybe a community partner or even your client, right? How do we make it as easy as possible for people to access this while still keeping it secure? And that can be done and managed in systems like SharePoint and Google Docs. So confidence that the document, that the permissions and access are in place to protect that document, but also confidence that the person accessing the document is only doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. Like maybe it's supposed to be read only, or maybe when they make changes, it's supposed to be tracking those changes, things like that. Ease of use, as I was talking about with accessibility, how easy is it for you as the legal aid organization to share those documents? How easy is it for the person outside of the organization to access and do what they need to do with those documents? And then really focusing on staff training. So And so what I'll say is that, we often encourage organizations who want to use SharePoint to manage their documents to collaborate externally by creating a separate location that they use to share documents out. So we'll encourage them to lock down their case files so that they cannot be shared directly with external users. And if a person needs to share those documents, they'd either need to make a copy or move them to what we might call like the reading room, right, for external people to be able to access those. And then when you're done with the sharing, you move it back into the secure case files location, right? But those types of procedures require a lot of training and support to make sure that staff are kind of following through on that stuff. But you might recognize that this is probably worlds better than just, oh, I need to share this with co-counsel. I'll attach this as an attachment in an email, right? From both a security standpoint, but also like version control and all of those other issues. When thinking about document management, it's also important to think about integrations, right? So case management system integrations, I talked about how Legal Server is integrated with things like SharePoint and Google Docs. And that's really, really important just from a sort of administrative kind of perspective, right? So if you think about you're trying to get all of your staff to keep case folders in one location, one particular location, it's much better to integrate with your case management system so that all of the case related files are accessible just from the case management system, so the staff don't have to think about creating a folder in one particular SharePoint site or one particular document library. It's just there already, right? And then, as legal aid organizations get more kind of comfortable with keeping files in cloud-based solutions like SharePoint or Dropbox or Google Docs. There's, the idea is that more cross-platform types of integrations might emerge that will make it a lot more, it'll make it a lot easier for organizations to really kind of get a bird's eye view or a picture of how documents are being interacted with and used in the organization, right? Also, the security benefits of being able to kind of analyze data related to documents, their usage, who's accessing them, um, how frequently are they being shared out, with whom are documents being shared, those types of things. Um, Integrating with data platforms to be able to kind of track and view and essentially at some point hopefully create dashboards will make the move to a document management solution kind of yield hopefully a lot more benefits. I do want to talk a little bit about document management systems using or document management with SharePoint. But first, I'd want to address the point that, yeah, that was raised in terms of what I was talking about for AI search, right? So AI assisted search currently, and I understand that this is all sort of needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But what I was suggesting is AI assisted search, say within SharePoint, ideally is just within your closed SharePoint environment, right? The AI only has access to your data within your Microsoft instance, and isn't, sharing it out or communicating it out. And unfortunately, I think the AI revolution that's happening right now, like it's happening, and Microsoft has turned AI on in so many of the different applications that we use, many times without us really being aware of it until we see this, like, oh, hey, do you want to use AI to help draft this letter? And suddenly, like, we realize something we didn't realize was available is already kind of operating in place. AI is going to be a part of what SharePoint offers. I don't know how easy it will be to turn it off if your organization says we don't want to use it. But if you do trust that it is contained and that the system is closed within just your organization's instance, the benefits for something like doing a search for files, I think, are tremendous. But obviously, the security of all of that and protecting privileged information is certainly a big concern, and something that every organization is going to have to figure out how to evaluate for themselves. So how do you do document management within something like SharePoint? Because I would venture to guess every organization probably has some exposure to SharePoint or Google Docs if you're a Google shop. So what I would say is that I've kind of defined these sort of different levels, right? There's basic beginner level functionality, which is just kind of having user updated metadata columns, um, file versioning, and teaching people to understand how versioning works in SharePoint. And then the basics of understanding file sharing and permissions management. Because most organizations that we've worked with, when we come in and we look at their SharePoint, people have been sharing documents like crazy, internally, but sometimes externally, without really understanding what that means, right? Like, typically what that means is you're giving somebody pretty much effectively permanent access to this document until you revoke it. But do you know how to revoke it? And maybe it's okay. Maybe this was meant to be shared permanently, but it's Microsoft kind of puts it on each person to really understand what it means to share when you're using something like SharePoint. And I think most staff just have a very, very surface level understanding of what that means. There's what I would say intermediate level functionality. So SharePoint does have that check-in, check-out, or check-out, check-in functionality. It's usually off by default. You can turn it on, and it can help with better version control and managing versions of documents. Most organizations, I would say, probably don't want to do it unless they've really thought through what that means. But you can turn that on if you are in a situation where maybe you've got like a big team working on a case and you've got people sort of stepping on each other's edits. With Microsoft Word Online now, and you don't have to use just the online web browser version, but you know, with documents, Microsoft documents saved in SharePoint, you can co-edit a document in real time in the same way that a Google Doc works, right? So most organizations might feel like we don't need to have this whole check-in, check-out functionality, but there are still use cases, and you know, some organizations do decide to follow that. You can also do things like create document approval workflows, right? So you can set something up where people can save a new file to a location and it gets marked automatically as pending approval. And somebody like a supervisor might get notified that this new document is here awaiting your approval. And then when that supervisor reviews it and marks it as approved, the original author might get a notification saying that the document was approved. So those are the types of workflows that could be implemented in something like SharePoint, and is really kind of more beyond the sort of basic SharePoint usage. And then having more complicated permission schema is something that you can do in SharePoint, so that, you know, you might be distinguishing certain document libraries are locked down for some people, but not others. And create, how do you create exceptions to that? How do you audit all of that, right? And make sure that things are not being inappropriately accessed. And then there's more advanced functionality in terms of implementing retention policies. So in SharePoint on the back end, and actually in all of your Microsoft 365 in the back end, you can create SharePoint or retention policies for things like emails, for categories of documents, and then also compliance alerts to be alerted if you know, a policy has been violated somehow. And that's something that requires kind of a lot of advanced thought and effort to kind of think through. And I'll just demonstrate, I'll just show very quickly what some of this looks like. So this is a demo SharePoint site that we have. So let's imagine you go into the case files. So this is an example of metadata, right? So this folder exists, and the legal server integration with SharePoint requires that the folder name can only be the case ID, which isn't very helpful because most people don't look at a case ID and know what case that is. So we have a tool that will apply metadata from legal server to the case folders, right? The client name, the problem code, the primary assignment, the case disposition, right? And that's all metadata about the documents within this case, right? These, everything within this folder belongs to this case, you know, this client, etc. But if you drill down further, what I was referring to in terms of kind of user edited metadata, you can add like this note column, right? Which would then allow me to just say briefly, this was, you know, this is the final motion and it was submitted on this date, right? And I don't have to bury that within the file name itself. One really helpful thing about SharePoint that I think people don't necessarily understand right off the bat is that SharePoint, when you create Word documents in SharePoint or save them in SharePoint, typically by default, autosave is on. And I know this doesn't look like a motion for summary judgment, but I just want to demonstrate. So when I open it, and let's say I hate Word Online and I want to open it on my desktop, which you can do. So this is my desktop. Oh, if I can grab it. This is my Microsoft Word app. You'll see that autosave is on by default, right? and anything that I type is being saved automatically. So, but what that really looks like is when I go into SharePoint and look at that document, I can look at the version history, and every time I've made a change, it creates a new version, right? So that small edit I just made created this version here, version number 4. And I can also decide, well, actually, let's say I viewed this version and that version, I want to go back to this version. I can restore it. So when I restore, it's actually, instead of erasing the changes I'd made, it's actually restoring that as the newer version, right? So it's sort of built to really kind of preserve the changes. And if I were collaborating on this document with other people within my organization, I would see other versions that they were creating. So that's another thing about managing documents within SharePoint, is if you can encourage people to get away from this idea of creating a new file to represent another draft, that would be really helpful in terms of cleaning up how you're managing these documents. One final thing I'll say, and then I'll see if there's other questions or comments. Um, you'll see that I had this PDF version as the final version and this Word version. In dedicated document management systems, typically, you'll have something that is representative of the document in that system. And I would be able to have both of these files within that document as versions. So I could even layer on this final PDF on, kind of almost think about it as being on top of the Word documents, and then looking in this motion for summary judgment folder, I would only see one thing there that just represents motion for summary judgment. And then if I wanted to see the drafts, I would go into the version control of that system and see not the PDF, not just the PDF, but the Word versions that went into creating that draft. Now, SharePoint doesn't allow you to do that because SharePoint is at its core wasn't built as a standalone document management system. It was kind of built as a information and file kind of management system. And so because one is a PDF, one is a docx, it doesn't really kind of allow you to do that. But just to kind of illustrate what a more advanced document management system might allow you to do that. But I would say most organizations, that probably isn't a pain point really, right? Like if you just had one Word file and one PDF, you would really kind of understand the PDF probably represents what was filed. Not to mention being able to add these notes. And so I want to answer one question. So is checkout protection the best way to protect a document as a template in SharePoint? Not really, because checking out the check-in, checkout functionality, the person who checks out the document can make edits to it, right? So if you want to save something as a template, you can actually create a new template. So if, and this is often done with letterhead, for example, you just add a template and you upload a Word document, and then somebody can come in and say new. And so if I were to add a letterhead Word document as a template and name it letterhead, it would show up here as one of the options under new. And so it might say new letterhead. It would have the word icon, but say letterhead. And then I could launch or sort of create a new letterhead document without modifying the template. So that's one way that you can do that in SharePoint. Another thing that you can do is you can always, through the permissions for the document, try to lock down the template so that people are forced to make a copy. That's another way to approach it as well. Yeah, but the check-in, check-out functionality is really like, what that would mean is if I checked this out and somebody else came here and started to try to edit it, they would get a message saying that Tony has this checked out. And they wouldn't be able to do anything with it. So hopefully that gave everybody, food for thought, things to think about how you might make some changes or suggest some changes for your approach to document management in something like SharePoint, I would say that you don't necessarily, again, have to kind of go whole hog and go through like a huge process right from the beginning. You can always start small and say, let's try let's try this approach, right? Let's try adding a notes column and encouraging people to describe the things that they're saving, and see how that goes. But you know, this is one of the areas where I think we've been seeing a lot more interest, and so uh, I think that there's probably we'll probably create a lot more content with LSNTAP to kind of guide people through sort of a journey into document management. And we'll share these slides, and if anyone has questions, very happy to, to entertain them um, separately. So I know we're at the end of the hour.
So I'm going to close the recording, and then I'll stick around for a few minutes if people have questions. So thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you found this helpful. We'll have the recording available on our YouTube channel in just a few days.